Ladies and gentlemen, a good afternoon to you all on YouTube. This is the YouTube viewers. I do this for you. I actually deal in many different forums. Psalms 58 verse 8 to 10 says, "As a snail which melts, let every one of them pass away, like the untimely birth a woman has, that they may not see the sun. Before your pots can feel the thorns, he shall take them away as with a whirlwind, both the living ones, and in his wrath he shall take them away. The righteous shall rejoice when he sees the vengeance, and he shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked." Justice. Don't ever think that wicked people are going to go doing wicked acts and be unpunished for it. Always believe they will be. By the way, Old Bailey actually has that written as an inscription in the front of its building. We're talking justice. Of course, we're talking Justice League. Now, there's some things I hear critics saying about this movie and detractors, which I think are wrong. However, I'm going to show you that I understand where they're coming from, because I usually understand what these people are saying. And then I'll show you why they're wrong. So let's get into it. We're going to look at the first part of the movie, the earliest part of the movie, the opening part of the movie. And if you look at the opening part of the movie, first of all, if you look at the date here, this is a little side note, you will notice that the date is before Superman died. In fact, it is a time when Superman is speaking to children. We haven't seen Superman speak to children throughout the trilogy until now. So he's being interviewed by children. And at a point before the battery of their camera dies and they can't interview him any further, he has been asked a very interesting question. What do you think is the best thing about planet Earth? And he thought for a while. He was about to answer, and the camera died. The battery died. But these kids were interviewing him about hope. Now, after everything goes to black, we get again into a scene. And this scene is a scene in which we see Batman apprehending a robber. But he's not apprehending the robber just to apprehend a robber. No. He's using him as bait to capture a parademon, which he captures, and it explodes. And then there are these three box-like signs it makes against the wall. And the robber, who is secured, because Batman has captured him, is hopping around tied up. And he says, "What is that?" And Batman, for the first time, answers any kind of criminal, saying a scout, because Batman himself is observing this. And then he starts to talk to Alfred and ignore the robber. And in their conversation, the robber comes back and he says, "You mean from space? You mean like an army?" And Batman goes on to speak with Alfred about starting to contact the team immediately. And the robber will not stop talking. He's like, "They're coming because he's gone. Superman, he's dead. Where does that leave us?" And Batman leaps off the ledge without answering him, of course, like typical Batman. And we go to black again. And then we get an introduction to Justice League. But it's not your usual introduction. There are no words said for a good 10 to 15 minutes. Instead, we have this song everybody knows, and we're seeing people mourning Superman all over the world. We're seeing it in Bangkok, Thailand, Metropolis, France, Paris, France, and exotic places like England. We see Lois Lane mourning Superman. We see Martha Kent mourning Clark. And then we see that the world, in their newspapers, in the Metropolis newspapers, we see that the world is mourning Superman's death and wondering if he's returned to his world, along with guys like Prince and Guys like David Bowie. But we can see that the world without Superman has become violent. People are hateful and rageful and fearful. And that leads us to seeing these terrorists try to take over Old Bailey. You know Old Bailey, that talks about protecting the fatherless, the widows, and persecuting the wrongdoer. That Old Bailey. And we see Wonder Woman looking down as these terrorists take this place. Now, so that you understand that I get what these detractors from this film are saying, they're talking about the fact that there are multiple scenes where the lead character that's being spoken about suddenly disappears, and we're in a totally different scene dealing with a totally different character. It's like we hit the refresh button. It's like we're watching a music video and then it stops and then there's another music video and that stops and then there's another music video, because we are changing venues, we're changing characters. And to them, it's messy. And to them, there is no plot. There's a series of events put haphazardly together. But they all look beautiful. But see, you must understand storytelling. And so I want to show you what a plot actually is. Because I think a lot of people don't even know what a plot is. A plot refers to the sequence of events inside a story which affect other events through the principle of cause and effect. The causal effects of a plot can be thought of as a series of sentences linked by and so. Plots can vary from simple structures such as in a traditional ballad to a complex interwoven series of events, sometimes referred to as imbroglio. Imbroglio. Now, most people can handle, especially with comic book movies. If it's another movie, it's different. If you go and watch a TV show like Law and Order, they use imbroglio because there are a series of events that may be happening simultaneously or close to each other. If you've ever watched Grey's Anatomy, where you have multiple characters, you see imbroglio. If you're watching a movie like Dunkirk, there is some imbroglio there, because while there are simultaneous events happening in different places with different characters, we have to interweave the plot. So sometimes I go to this character, sometimes I go to this character. Now, what makes the plot interconnected is not necessarily a protagonist. See, with simple plots, which are called the traditional ballad of a storytelling, you follow a character known as the protagonist throughout the movie. You never once lose sight of the protagonist. Take, for instance, Wonder Woman. Take, for instance, Man of Steel. For the most part, you're following the protagonist and their view of life, and you're going through the movie. Take, for instance, Spider-Man Homecoming. Take, for instance, Batman The Dark Knight. Batman Begins. Etc. Zack Snyder uses the imbroglio style of storytelling. The Watchmen was a story in which you were following Rorschach all the way to the end. So the story had connectivity. However, Batman v Superman theatrical cut, you were following multiple characters. Sometimes you're following Lex Luthor. Sometimes you're following Lois Lane. Sometimes you're following Bruce Wayne. And sometimes you're following Clark Kent. You're following multiple characters. It's an interwoven plot and interwoven story. It's imbroglio. And each of these different scenes that you are watching are interlinked to one another. Let me show you how this happens with the series of scenes I showed you. Superman was introduced by these children, he's speaking about hope and how hope can come and go, how it can be dead and then it can be resurrected, and how hope is always around. If you dig around, even though you lose it, and it's easy to lose, you can find it. And as he's on the verge of talking about the best thing about planet Earth, the camera dies, and then we move to the scene in Batman where we find out that the interview we had with Superman was before, and he's now dead. So that this scene connects to the previous scene by saying, so Superman is dead. The scene before is showing us where Superman was alive, how wonderful the world was with him, and now he's dead, connecting the scene where he was alive with his death. Okay? Now, some people would say, oh, that's messy because it doesn't tell me that this scene was a cause for that scene. It's messy. It tells you about the scene before, that what you were looking at before was when Superman was alive. But he's no longer alive. He's dead. And the soul aspect of it is explained in this scene. In this scene, the burglar, which Batman captures, explains what is happening. That because Superman is dead, there are enemies coming. An army. We learn about what's happening in the absence of Superman. At first we begin to value Superman and that he's alive and well. We find out he's dead, and because he's dead, this scene tells us that there's danger coming and that human beings are vulnerable to that danger. They're explaining to you Batman's ideology and his fears from BVS, which you don't need to know about in this movie, but it's connective tissue. So Superman is dead, and so the world is subject to attack by these aliens. That leads us into this series of scenes where people are mourning Superman's death. And these scenes now say, and so, because Superman is dead and these aliens are approaching, people are panicking. People are giving into fear and hate. But also some principal characters. See, we saw Superman. We saw Batman. Now we're seeing Lois Lane, who was presented next, who was Superman's girlfriend, and Martha Kent, who was Superman's mother, who she related to him as Clark. Not Superman, but Clark, particularly. Clark's mother, are grieving his loss. And we see that the world is grieving Superman's loss and wondering where he has gone to. And while they're wondering about that, they're also giving in to hate and fear, which is what we see next. And the hate and fear is what leads the terrorist to want to destroy the institution of law and justice. You know the wicked people I just talked about in Scripture? And that enters Wonder Woman, the final of the Trinity. See, we had Superman, then we had Batman, and then we have Wonder Woman. Okay? We had Lois Lane, and we had Martha Kent. These were all the principal characters of BVS, Batman v Superman. We didn't have principal. The Flash wasn't much in Batman v Superman. Aquaman wasn't there, and Cyborg wasn't there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, this is how we go. Superman begins this movie talking about hope and what's the best thing about planet Earth that he found out about. And then we find out, and so we find out that he's dead. And because he's dead, aliens are coming. And there are armies. And how are humans protected by this? We don't know. And so the world is mourning Superman because he's dead. But the world is also fearful of alien attack, which you see in the newspaper. And their fear and hate and xenophobia leads them to do horrendous actions. And so terrorists are trying to take out Old Bailey. to carry back man back into time. And so Wonder Woman is there to stop them. You see the connectivity? So there is a connectivity here in the plot and in the story, and it's hinted through and through and through the threads. Okay? Superman was alive. Connectivity, Superman is dead. And so aliens are coming. The world is vulnerable. And so the world's mourning Superman because he's dead. And they're also filled with panic and fear because a plague of aliens everybody knows is coming, which is said in the song as well as with the terrorists. And so Wonder Woman has to stop these terrorist actions. See the flow? So there is a flow, but because people are not very familiar, especially in the comic book genre, people are not familiar with this sort of style of storytelling called imbroglio, which is interwoven plot. You find that a lot of people are saying that the movie is messy, including very highly, supposedly authorities and experts in the field suddenly start judging this film totally different to every other movie out there. I've heard some of these so-called experts who are in film school, studying film, saying that Zack Snyder's movies are shallow, that really people are reading too much into his movies because they don't get the verbal cues. See, in movie making, which is another point I want to make, there are visual cues, there are verbal cues, and a director can choose to subtly indicate a visual cue, or they may very obviously give a verbal cue with the visual cue to make sure you have no doubt in your mind what they're saying. And you're very clear. Zack Snyder uses both, but he is a minimalist, which means that Zack prefers to show you something and have you get the cue of what it's saying. I heard one such critic say, well, you know, I always thought I read so much into his movie 300, which I find it has a lot of lore in it, but it's not a very deep film. I've never been a fan of 300 like that. But they read so much into his film 300, and I think people are reading too much into things like Batman v Superman and Man of Steel and now Justice League. Zack Snyder's not that great a director. And I've heard other people compare him to Michael Bay, etc. Now, when I say Zack Snyder's a genius, I don't say things trivially and lightly. I say he's a genius because what Zack does in a film is not only does he tie that film to previous films or tie it to previous comic book entities and comic book characters and comic book series. Not only does he tie in current events that happen in social culture, he calls them pop culture events, but I know Zack's a lot much more deeper in his thought process than meets the eye. He usually underplays what he says. In other words, he talks down what he's really trying to do. But nonetheless, the thing that really amuses me about this man, and I just don't know, I don't know what inspired him to do it like this way, unless he's in some way spiritual, but Zack is able to tell a story in a very familiar format, which, if you're not paying attention, you will not realize that he's subversively sharing with you something new you have not seen before. But he packages it in such a way. Take, for instance, the Owls of Galul. The Owls of Galul is talking about a hero's journey as well. But it's packaged in such a way that Zack says, when you truly see who a hero really is, in its nutshell, it is not a hero that you really worship. truly a hero is not worth worshiping at all. It is really the idea the hero holds fast to. And it must be a practical, workable idea. And I think that's the beauty of Zack Snyder. And I pretty much believe Zack is not about hero worship. The irony of the situation. He has made superhero movies. He's made animated films. He's made 300. He's made all these films. And that's not what he's shooting for. Zack has been shooting for an idea. And to me, that's the beautiful thing about these movies. It's that each and every one of us can do these things in some of the very simplest of ways. I remember Patty Jenkins verbalizing what Zack would not say, because he does not verbalize this. But if you watch Sucker Punch, if you watch Watchmen, 300, Dawn of the Dead, Owls of Gahul, etc., Zack's always been looking to empower you. He's always been looking so that you, the viewer, you, the listener, you would embrace these things. It was never about superheroes, my friend. It wasn't about superheroes with Zack. It was about the values that they represented. He wanted you to know that these are the things you represent at certain points in time. And if you hold fast to those things, you become empowered to make the world even better than it presently is. Now, of course, that is probably just my understanding of the thing. Maybe Zack wasn't going that far. Yeah, right. I think that's what he's all about. If you've ever checked out Sucker Punch especially, which is a movie about it's a tragedy. It's a very sad movie, but in that movie, even though this young lady had very little leeway, she still had control about how she could go about handling her present reality. And in a very beautiful but unique way, she managed to get herself to become lobotomized. And in the end, she was able to get justice for the situation. Tragically, she had to be lobotomized for it to happen. But still, she made that choice. She made that choice that justice would be served best through she herself freeing herself from her present situation. It's a lot more complicated than that, but suffice to say, we'll stay with that. And so I find those movies interesting because it says that, and it's a very psychological movie, Sucker Punch. So if you're not into psychological movies, maybe you want to take that and kind of bypass it. But if you're into psychological movies, which Zack usually has some sort of psychology he's looking at, then Sucker Punch is really the movie for you. And a lot of moviegoers today are very superficial, so it's kind of hard to go into movies with them because they can't see, and then they say, "Oh, well, you're just assuming that this is what it is," because they can't see it. It's okay. But like I said before, I think superhero movies have always led us to want to have hero worship and to talk about this hero and that hero. But we never talk about ourselves and the potential we have in ourselves. I believe that's what Patty Jenkins was able to verbalize that Zach did not verbalize, which is, she said, Wonder Woman basically represents attributes we all have for ourselves and humanity. And I believe that's something Zach very strongly believes himself. In the real world, there are real heroes. There are real people who represent these values. And each and every one of us, we actually have those attributes in us. But just that these attributes are on display in a fictitious character. And Zach put it in a real world setting so that we could have a feeling of what it is we would go through having represented these characteristics. These are the tests and trials we would face. So I find that beautiful when I talk about these movies. You know, I'm not fickle, guys. You know that. So I decided to share with you guys why critics would say, oh, this thing has a bad story, has a bad plot. That's why they say it, because they're looking at it through the lens of the traditional ballad of plot. But when you look at it in the context of imbroglio, it connects just fine. Each scene connects to the next one just fine. Alright? You guys have a great one.